this computer. So welcome everyone, and today we have Luciana de Oliveira students. Those who just joined us, Luciana got pulled into an emergency meeting. She's a dean at her university, and we're thankful for her doctorate students who will step in and do the presentation.
Hello, everyone. It's such an honor to be here with you all. And so my name is Alice. You can see there, Alessandra Elizabeth. I'm a Brazilian person. I mean, a Brazilian student, and I'm now here in the US with Dr. Lu. She calls me Beth. And Ruslan, it's such a pleasure to be with you and see you here. I didn't have a chance to talk to you in person in the TESOL in Portland, but I saw your presentation with Lu first day there. So I'll be like sharing screen, okay, here. And so we can start. Let me just open. And okay. Is everyone able to see the... Yes? Okay, good. Yeah. So I'll be starting. Yes? Is it okay?
Could you, oh, sorry.
Yeah.
It went away for a second. There we go. Never mind.
All right. Okay. So again, it's an honor to be here. Like, I have this responsibility to open because, as Ruslana said, Dr. Lu had this emergency meeting, last minute thing. And then, yeah. So we are like Tara, Ja, and I are here representing our group. Multilingual learners in schools, and the title of this presentation to share with you all and learn from you all is Systemic Functional Linguistics, Constructing a Cohesive Message. So it's the focus of our presentation today. So these are the other participants. You can see Dr. Lu here very happily holding her book, and then that's me. Then John that is here with us, Tara, and we also have Joy, Destiny, Dr. Karen Terrell, and Sylvia that is not, unfortunately, is not here on the picture. So we as multilingual speakers and learners, we understand the challenge that is to, let's say, interact with language and engage with language. And then when we're thinking about language, we're thinking about language in various societies, in various contexts. I mean, like interacting in social life, but also thinking of academic language. And then academic language is another aspect of language. And so it's quite challenging. And we know that researchers say that the number of multilingual learners in various countries has been increasing. So that's why it's such relevant for us as teachers to think about multilingual learners and the way they interact with language, the way it would make sense. So thinking about this, we are thinking about people that speak other languages other than English, just like me in terms of thinking about Portuguese. That's my first language, my mother tongue. So multilingual learners, the idea here that we're bringing to these, the importance for them to explore how language is used, like in conversations, in oral scenarios, but also in texts, and how meanings are presented in various content areas that we have. So our focus is to show and talk about like our perspective from language as a functional, based on the functional systemic functional linguistics, that is a theory of language. We see this as an approach to discourse analysis, and we're thinking about analyzing language orally, thinking about oral language, thinking about written language as well. And then it's a pedagogical approach that can be implemented in classrooms. And then it shows the students, it raises teachers' awareness to think about language as the core of learning content, because when you're teaching social studies, math, science, we are not thinking about, we cannot forget language, because we see language through I mean, these contents are not, let's say, deprived from language. We have to always remember this and have this in mind. So learning language, thinking about this, the language approached, yeah, based on content instruction. So learning language from this perspective means learning the options that are available in the new language to make meanings of different kinds for particular purposes in various situations. And when we think about the teacher's role in this aspect, in this kind of approach, it's actually like to discuss with the students, the speakers, the writers, the choices that we have to make in languages. And then when we are talking about learning content, we're talking about learning language, and we have to try to think about how we are going to address let's say, this conversation, this talk, this learning. We tend to think that these words that we are going to call here meta language are basically, let's say, nouns and verbs and adjectives, but this sometimes doesn't make much sense to many people. So the development of a meta language with learners is crucial. And then we see meta language, like we define meta language as a language for talking about language. That is functional, that it's meaningful, like for this kind of discussion. And a meta language provides a means for focusing on and engaging in talk about wording, yeah, in the texts that us multilingual learners read and write. So a functional meta language connects to meaning, and it supports curriculum goals as it offers explicit ways to connect to the knowledge to be learned. So when we think about language sometimes and thinking about learning other content areas, we sometimes tend to go for like vocabulary. And it's, as Dr. Lu likes to say, it's much more than vocabulary. Yeah, so it's very important to bear this in mind. And then Tara and Ja will be explaining more in terms of giving details and also a practice for all of us so we can understand it better. This kind of meta language is important for multilingual learners to recognize the choices that they can make in the new language and the new learning new languages in these content areas. So again, I mean, just mentioned this already. Most teachers are familiar with this traditional meta language, but it doesn't make that much sense sometimes to many speakers, to many writers, yeah, to many learners in general. So that's why we're bringing here this moment, like we're here in this moment now, just to discuss more and understand that anytime that we use language, we are simultaneously presenting some kind of content, enacting a relationship with a listener or a reader, and organizing this content in some way by building a cohesive message. So the leaders will be continuing here. Ja?
Yeah, sure. So as Beth mentioned, drawing on the meta functions in systematic functional linguistics, 3 areas of meaning are derived. They're presenting content, enacting relationships, and constructing a cohesive message. So first, let's take a look at the presenting the content. Presenting content actually investigates the participants involved in particular process under specific circumstances. So unlike traditional grammar learning, which only focuses on isolated words in a sentence, functional grammar that draws on SFL focuses on meaningful chunks in the context. While teaching content area texts, teachers can break down each sentence, into participant chunk, process chunk, and circumstance chunk to help multilingual learners better understand the meaning and language features of each sentence. And participants refer to who is participating in the process. And they are composed of nouns or noun groups, or they can be human or non-human, such as people or human, or they can be non-human, places, things, and ideas, they're non-human, right? And processes are the basic unit of a clause. and they are constructed in a verb or verb group. For example, we have doing verbs, relating verbs, thinking verbs, feeling verbs, and seeing verbs. These are all what we mean by process. And circumstances are made up of adverbs or prepositional phrases to convey meaning related to the time or place or manner or causes, etc. Okay, and yeah, thank you. And a few things that we wanted to emphasize here are for presenting content, we focus on the content of the message. And while we're focusing on the whole text, we can examine individual units within a full text. And the basic unit of a language analysis within a text is the clause, right? And sentences can have just one sentence, one clause, but sometimes a sentence has more than one clause. There are multiple clauses and even embedded clauses, right? And the basic unit of a clause is a process and construed in a verb. Okay, this is what we wanted to emphasize for presenting content. And the next slide is that we talk about enacting relationships. So enacting relationships examine mood choices. For example, declarative mood, interrogative mood, or imperative mood. And we also look at modality. For example, modal verbs like can, should, these are modal verbs, or modal adjectives, for example, necessary or possible, or modal adverbs like certainly, possibly, and modal nouns, for example, necessity, possibility, these are modal nouns. So learning to identify mood choices will help students understand how an author communicates with the reader, right? And about evaluative meanings, here refer to language choices used to make evaluations. Specifically, they can be expressions of attitude, and these expressions can be graded showing strength or force. An attitude can be divided into 3 categories. The first category is affect. So it's expressions of feelings to build up empathy and suspenses. The possible affective words, here we give you some examples like happy, laugh, love, hug. These are positive affect words. For the negative words, we can look at something like sadly, misery, dislike. Okay, so these are examples for affect. And the second category is we want to share is judgment. It is expressions of moral judgments of people's behavior. And the positive judgment examples could be lucky or normal, or the negative examples could be unfortunate, odd, weird. And the last category we want to share here is appreciation. It is expressions of assessment of the quality of objects. The positive words can be good, lovely, enjoyable, and the negative words could be dull, boring, and smelly. Okay, so these are about enacting relationships. And the next slide, we talk about constructing a cohesive message. Okay, constructing a cohesive message explores given or new patterns and cohesion. So given new patterns contribute to building the organization of a text and contribute to flow of information from sentence to sentence. And the given, or what we actually call known information, is placed at the beginning of a clause. And the new, or what we call unknown information, encompasses the remaining bit of the clause. So often new information from one clause is presented as given in the following clause. so more information can be added. And tracking giving a new patterns can help us see how the text is organized from clause to clause and paragraph to paragraph. And given choices are important for organizing and moving a text forward. And the new information can also help with information flow when it is presented as given in a subsequent clause. So more information can be added. And this new to given pattern can function for linking with prior discourse so that information can be built up. Okay, we will show you an example shortly. Don't worry about it. I know this is too theoretical, but Tara will share example with you all. Okay, about cohesion refers to the way a text hangs together with cohesive devices. For example, pronouns like they, that, her, this, or this can be used as cohesive device. And for synonyms and substitutes can also be cohesive devices. For example, here we have the Declaration of Independence in a paragraph, maybe mentioned at the beginning as the Declaration of Independence, but in the next sentence they might say, "Oh, this document," that's a substitute, right? And connectors, for example, and, despite, if, we've been using this all the time for writings. And it also, cohesion can also refer to cohesive devices cohesive devices are the words or the groups of words that create links within the text. Okay. All right. And for this next slide, please. So here we want to give you a full picture of what the three areas of meaning are and the relationship to metafunctions. So as we mentioned in the previous slides, according to systematic functional linguistics, meanings are realized through the three major functions as ideational, interpersonal, and textual, as you can see here to the left of the slide. So ideational function, metafunction refers to how we experience, how our experience is construed. The interpersonal metafunction focuses on actually how to enact social relationships. And the textual metafunction is concerned with text organization. So these three metafunctions are actually respectively equivalent to the three areas of meaning on this slide that you can see. So in the table to the left, presenting content equivalent to ideational in the metafunction. And so questions that you can ask while teaching could be, what is the text about? What are the key concepts about? And for enacting a relationship with the reader, it is equivalent to interpersonal. And questions could be, what is the author's perspective, and how does the author of the text, interact with the reader, with the reviewer? And the last layer of the meaning is constructing a cohesive message, which is equivalent to textual. So things like questions like, how is the text organized? How does the text construct a cohesive message? So the reason we are introducing the area of meaning, because these are actually more accessible for teachers in real life while unpacking a text, right? So, okay, that is about, three areas of meaning. Okay, I will hand it over to Tara to share some examples with you.
Yes, awesome. Thank you, Ja and Beth and Ruslana. Before we go to this slide, maybe Beth, if you could go back one, just before we get into it. I wanted to ask the audience, the members of TESOL Ukraine, and what examples or ideas you have so far of what we've covered and your own experiences about this kind of learning. If anyone wants to type in the chat or use, you can turn on your microphones.
Can you go back a slide, because this slide is a little too abstract to focus on? Yeah. So in the previous trainings, we have talked quite a bit about modality and opening up spaces for other voices through different modal resources and really moderating how when you write an argument and you want to cite evidence or you want to cite research, to use part of modality resources is also reporting verbs. And one example was if you say the author declares, or the author claims, or the versus the author suggests, or research suggests, or research maybe recommends, or so the choice of modality can go on the scale from very high modality to medium and to low. So that's how I'm connecting the interpersonal metafunction and the work of citing verbs and reporting verbs in writing arguments. I'm sure others would be willing to share some of their connections or memories of what we've been sharing this year. So please chime in. So when I'm looking at this chart, actually, the processes like reporting verbs and saying verbs, they can also go into the category of enacting relationship with the reader, just based on the examples that come from argumentation. And argumentation is a really powerful genre for teaching modality through different resources. So.
Yeah, I find a lot of connections too as a teacher, not only with written text and demonstrating that for students, but also if I happen to be lecturing to them at the moment, how am I building cohesion within my speech? Am I connecting my ideas and drawing attention to a pronoun that I might have substituted for the noun that was given at the beginning of the text or my speech? How am I drawing their attention to my choices and things that change throughout? Very explicitly and very intentionally, because I think as a native English speaker myself, it's not always clarified that you can build this kind of cohesion with intention and share that. It's not, Dr. Liu always talks about code breaking within her 6 C's of support with a functional approach. So understanding that this is sometimes coded into text and language and not talked about explicitly. So now we'll have some examples so we can move forward. So some examples for constructing a cohesive message. We talked about the patterns using something that is given, introducing something that is new, and how it contributes to the flow of a text or a speech. The given or known information is typically placed at the beginning of the new clause, and it's reframing and refreshing the reader to remember the given information in a new way. And this was cited again in work with Holiday that you guys have studied, correct?
We're not studying Halliday Matheson. We're just meeting monthly to discuss his work, but not really like reading a book. Not reading 800 pages of introductory material.
No, but the name is familiar, so we're
Yeah,
trying to
yeah.
make some connections. Okay. So this example is from a text. I believe it's a second grade science text. So it has some examples of given and new. I will let you all read to yourselves. If you could make little notes about what you think some examples of given information and new information are. And then before we go to the next slide, we'll talk about it. And then we'll talk with a graph using this text. So I'll give everybody some time.
Can you do the think aloud of walking us through how we would identify given and new information before we are asked to do it independently?
Oh, yes, absolutely. At the moment, my class is going to be walking in the door, so I'll let them say hello. They're going to work, but I'm going to keep talking. So you guys are good? Okay.
Great.
All right. So the first thing, if you're looking at a text, for example, if we're doing a science text in second grade, we might identify, like John mentioned, the processes, the participants, the circumstances. So we can read the first sentence together. Seeds form after a flower is pollinated. And we think, okay, what is the participant? What is the process? And what is the circumstance in that first sentence alone? So we identify what's starting the text. Then once you move on through the text, you can start to draw connections. So the very next sentence starts with pollination. And we notice the last sentence ended with pollinated as a process. And the next one begins with pollination as a participant, as the circumstance. So it's taking on a new role with the same type of word. And then how that word builds into the action, we see pollen again. We have other new vocabulary that's introduced. What role does that play? Just making notes of certain chunks of words, like John mentioned. Each sentence is they have parts of sentences and different clauses. How do they contribute to each other? And how, when we get to the final sentence, pollen sticks to the animals' bodies. How does that relate then to the first sentence? What are we connecting throughout the whole text? How does that sound? Noticing how the terms might change from processes to participants and reverse from participants to processes.
Hey Lou, perfect timing. Luciana is joining us. So I'm noticing that the word pollen at the last sentence is connected all the way up to the word pollen in the second line.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah.
And do you notice it takes either a different form at the end of the sentence or the same form? And what do you think about that?
Well, pollination and pollen are related. So it's kind of assumes that kids will know what that means. So you need to teach the students that pollen and pollination are related and how they are related. Pollination is a process. Pollinated is a verb in past tense, because it's important to talk about what happens to the flower and not who's doing the pollination in this case. And then pollen is carried, and then the example is done through the bees, birds, and bats, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
I think especially
nectar, sweet liquid. And then my question is like, is pollen and sweet liquid, is that the same thing? I'm a second grader.
Right.
It's the nectar that's a sweet liquid.
Mm-hmm.
And it's introduced by a comma. So hi, everybody. Sorry, I'm jumping in, but it's been crazy at work. And the verb is pollinate, right?
Yeah.
So, but it usually is not used in the active voice, it's used in the passive voice, is pollinated, right? In the case here. in the first sentence that is used as in the passive voice is pollinated. So just
Yeah,
wanted-
your students are doing great. I'm glad you're here.
Thank you.
So we can go to the next slide and see how this text was kind of breaking down and showing the connections between the processes, the participants, the circumstances, and how it changes through the text. So we see the given and the new at the top of this table. At the beginning of the text, the given is seeds. And we see the clause, it's formed after a flower is pollinated. And that's italicized because it will contribute to the next sentence and the flow of the text as it turns into a noun, or from a verb to a noun, from pollinated to pollination as a circumstance. And pollination is then defined
As a participant.
as a participant.
Yes. The pollination is a participant.
And then it goes on to define and bring out new participants, pollen, animals, and then shows some arrows how they contribute to the next sentences. And maybe clarified, such as animals, we're expanding to birds, bees, and bats. Pollen is then reused the word pollen because there's a sentence in the middle that doesn't refer to them. So we're not going to substitute it with a pronoun to ensure that we have a cohesive message. The same term is going to be used again when it's not directly flowing from the sentence previous. Okay. And I can speak to these slides. These are also from Dr. D's text. So I don't know, Dr. D, if you would like to speak to them.
I don't think we need to go over them. It's just more of, and Ruslana has seen this because she helped me add this column here on the side, on the left side, for the explanation of the different cohesive devices. So it flows as reference, substitution, ellipsis, connectors, and lexical cohesion. We're going to talk a little bit more about lexical cohesion, but there are lots of examples, and we're happy to share the PowerPoint with you. So I'm not going to go over each one. It's just as an example. So we can go to the next slide. And then here are the examples for each one of those areas of cohesive devices. So let's go to that.
Yes. And this slide comes from we developed a book study on systemic functional linguistics as a team, as our research group. So this was taken from a book by Eggins in our references, and kind of outlines the overall picture, the big picture of how we can use words intentionally to construct lexical cohesion. So we can also share this through Ruslana, and we can move on to the next slide because we have some more examples. Okay. All right, so this is an example of cohesive writing in mathematics, something a little more content heavy and less clear. This example is from Travoid from 2020, and it shows a text that is taken from the text at the top is saying the question as a right triangle, ABC is a right triangle, and find the angle of, or the degree of angle U. So there's some text in asking you to do some activities with this, but how are we going to navigate this example? We can go to the next slide. And this table is a little bit more detailed, but it breaks down the explanation that's used in the text, the natural language, the mathematical notations, and then it says images or schematic language that is used. and the cohesive ties are written in the center. I can't see it as well. I can zoom in myself on my screen. Apologies, I'm working from one screen this morning. All right, so for example, they have pronouns referring to a noun, such as she. Oh. No. Sorry, this example is going with the slide 21, Beth, sorry. That's why I was a little confused. Okay, here's a different mathematics equation or example that we can use to talk about the language. This question says, Kim builds a pattern of squares. He builds like this, and they show step 1, step 2, and step 3. He uses 1 square for step 1, 3 squares for step 2, and 6 for step 3. How many squares should he use in step 4? All right, so then the table prior to just talked about the different forms that we need to identify to be able to understand how this question developed cohesively. For example, they used Kim as the participant. They replaced Kim with a pronoun in the following sentence and used he. And that image is not, okay. And other examples such as this, I apologize. We can have, would anybody like to contribute to some ideas about how to build cohesive structures or a cohesive message for this example?
Is your question, how is cohesion built here?
Yes.
Okay. There is omission in one square for step 1, 3 squares for step 2, and 6 for step 3. And we are supposed to remember that 6 refers to squares, but it's on the instead of repeating, it's omitted.
Mm-hmm.
There's also something that is not underlined, but it's something really interesting that happens a lot in mathematics and also in other texts too. But it's what we call the reference forward instead of reference back. Can you find that example? It's not highlighted. Reference forward. Instead of saying he
builds like this. He
yes,
builds like this.
Like this. And this is what is showing next. It's very different than what we are used to, because with this, that, those kinds of pronouns, it's usually a reference back.
Yeah.
And sometimes you repeat the words. So you can say this process or this activity, meaning the one that came before. But in this particular case, it is a reference forward. So that's quite interesting too. And they didn't even highlight that in the book, in the example that we're giving, but it's there.
Yeah. That's an important one, just for the reasons that you said, how this usually repackages. This process is called evaporation. and it refers
Mhm.
to the paragraph above.
Yes. Exactly. Okay. Let's go back to any questions or comments or anything so far before we move on. Could be just a comment on what we've discussed so far. And feel free to use the chat too if you're able. You don't have to unmute and say anything, just use the chat box.
Oh, just I have an idea, but maybe it can sound a bit silly. It's about that example about seeds and the process of pollination. And that just I began to think about multilingual communication. It reminded me about such process. That just bees, then animals, then bats were mentioned in that example, and they spread the seeds all around. And we, people from different cultures and with different language communicate, and we just exchange the ideas using these same words or these seeds communicating here, or just in our life. And for me, it is some kind of metaphor, this example.
That's interesting, yeah. Thank you. Okay, we have a few more examples. And is that Beth?
I can read this part.
Okay.
Okay. So to consider how to construct cohesive messages through register, we need to remember that all the things that go on in a situation at the time of language, only these three have a direct and significant impact on the type of language that will be produced. And that includes field, which is the what, the function for relating experience, tenor, the who, or a function of creating interpersonal relationships, and the mode, which is how. So how is a function organized with information? And that degree of grammatical complexity and lexical density of the language are highly sensitive to mode variation.
So that means when you're speaking, there are certain choices, that you make that are going to be different oftentimes from when you write. So that's really what this is all about. It's so when we say that written language is complex and spoken language is less complex, that's actually a misconception of mode, because there are different levels of grammatical complexity and lexical complexity for both. So they're just different levels of complexity. And of course, in writing, we have usually time to proofread and things like that. And in spoken language, you say something and then you can go back and rephrase and that sort of thing, but it's just a different kind of process. And so that's really what this is all about in terms of complexity and the connection between complexity and mode. So we can go to the next slide. I can do the next slide. So that's what we're talking about here. So we talk about a mode continuum. So of course, here we're just contrasting spoken and written language. But as you can see, there's complexity in both. as we're talking about the mode like continuum. So there are some resources. I think Ru is sharing a resource there for you on spoken and written language, and it's just interesting for you to know what those differences are. And if you were teaching English, right? I think most of you teach English. Then there are certain things that you can also highlight for students for both, speaking and then differences between speaking and writing. Okay, I think we can go to the next slide. So this is about nominalization and how it builds what we call lexical density. So we increase lexical density through the process of nominalization, through the process of creating nominalizations. And so what that means is really that you are expanding your nominal groups with pre-modifiers and post-modifiers. So with a nominal group, you have things like spiders, right? So one single noun, but you could have pre-modifiers, right? We call them what comes before the noun. So like the 3 spiders. And then you can add on to the lexical density by adding more information to the nominal group. And so that's like, if we read the last one, the smallest of the 3 shiny redback spiders spinning their website in the corner. So spiders is the noun, right? So if you think about that, and then you have all of these pre-modifiers, and then you also have some post-modifiers, right? And it's the same kind of idea with a verbal group. It's not nominalized, but the verbal group can also be expanded depending on the verb tense that you use and things like that. And so if you add modality, right? So the may have been going to have been spinning. I don't know anybody who says that, but maybe in writing, you may write that at some point. But it's just interesting to highlight that you can also think about the verbal group and how you can expand the verbal group. It wouldn't be through nominalization. Nominalization really is referring to the first part, the nominal group, but we wanted to provide an example to that the verbal group can also be expanded. I think we can go to the next slide.
So these are some exercises we found to practice sentence clarity through nominalization. So recognizing terms in their nominal form or their verb form, things like that. So we can do number 1. We have intention, intent, and intend, and how the different modes are used. So who knows, who can write or contribute the idea for the answer of the one that is nominalized?
Sorry, can you repeat the question? Are we looking at the 7, 8, 9 or 1, 2, 3?
1, 2, and 3.
Okay. And the question again is?
Which of the 3 within each number are the example of a nominalized word?
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, feel free to chat, to type in the chat.
Good. Mhm.
Can I say? If it is quick, just so if from the verb intent, we have intent and intention, both nouns, yes? Is it nominalization?
Intent and intention. With the D?
Intention, noun, intent, noun, and intended, the last one is verb, yes?
Yes.
Mhm.
And the
So-
nominalization, intention will probably be what you want to call the nominalization, but both are nouns. You're correct.
But why
Intention.
not intent, for example, if it is also noun?
That's a great question. That's the
I
problem.
just wonder because if I understand correctly, we have intention in our common English, like we are going to do something, yes? But if we speak about intent, in legal English, it has the criminal intent to do something, yes?
Yeah,
So those
I
are
think both
nouns.
would be, yeah.
Can it be nominalized in both variants, not one?
Yeah, you're right. Both intent and intention are nominal or could be nominalizations. And of course, that's the problem of doing isolated words, right?
I was just going to say that.
Yeah.
It speaks to the big picture. We're not focused on vocabulary in isolation, learning words and their effects in isolation. It's all within the context.
Mhm.
The
Yeah,
sentence,
so then
the
the
text.
second line, it is disagreement, yes, and the third line, we have exploration, yes?
Yes, that's right. So the
Now-
first one, really, we have two nominalizations
Okay.
potentially as they're used in texts. Yeah, very good.
And just to
And then-
note that it's not only Shen words that are nominalization,
Mhm.
that if you Google nominalization, that's gonna be the definition. Typically with the Shen words, educate, education, discuss, discussion. However, there are an entire clause can be nominalized. For example, it rained for 3 years and caused a lot of damage. These annual floods, so the annual floods is the nominalization of or repackaging of the previous clause. It rained for annual, it rained every year. It rained every year, these annual floods. So those instances are more kind of unusual. They are typical, but we don't talk about them as much. We typically talk about the Shen words.
And I think that was a good point, Luciana, to talk about from one sentence to the next, how it flows and you're
Yes.
repackaging these words. It's all about using nominalization to construct that cohesive message. So how can you recognize that this verb form took on a new form in the next sentence
Yes.
and what was the purpose? Things like
Yes.
that.
So
Yeah,
I
so
would-
we
I
have other
would-
examples,
Yeah,
but
yeah. And then if we had the whole text, that would be an interesting exercise to track cohesion
Yes.
through nominalization.
I mean, we can go back to slide 15, I believe it was, with the pollination and the seed, and we can see how that text developed with nominalization.
Oh,
This
yeah.
one.
Pollination.
So we can use this text and if you can pick out verbs that were nominalized, nouns that were changed back.
So from pollinate, we have pollination, yes?
Yep.
Mhm.
Yep.
Yeah, yeah.
Exactly. So if we go to the next slide.
And that's it.
Yeah,
That's it. Yes.
Not very dense.
Is. Yeah, and usually, and actually what comes before talks about the whole process until the verb is used, like is pollinated, but it does talk, there's more information there. It's just we are extracting just to show this part. But yes, is pollinated is turned into pollination. And that's a very typical process in science, meaning turning a verb into a noun, and then it contributes to the flow of information.
What would be interesting to do is to study a Ukrainian text in science and to see how Ukrainian language creates cohesion and repackages information from the previous clause to the next and the next. So anybody who wants to do Ukrainian language analysis, please write to me. I'm looking for volunteers. Not kidding.
Great, that's wonderful. And I think we can go to our next, to our final slides, because I'm looking at the time. So
We had another example of a text that was taken from a written academic piece and then it interpreted into a more a less formal setting. So how is that structured dependent on the circumstance of the text? So the field. So we can take time to read and point out some differences and connections between the text if we have time. Yes? Okay.
I love these two texts. A reproduction with variation is a major characteristic of life. And then if you look below, you contrast, you can put it next to each other, left and right. It's a little easier to see it. All organisms reproduce, and sometimes when they reproduce, all the children vary. Oh, interesting. The reproduction with variation.
So we have here reproduction, reproduce, and we have variation, vary.
And see, it takes fewer words. Because reproduce is repeated twice. And in the second instance. So the language becomes more dense when you repackage it through nominalization and shorter. Complexity becomes lexical. Density becomes complexity is in the lexical density, not grammatical complexity necessarily. Grammatically, it's a very simple sentence, but the density of language is insane.
Precisely.
Yeah, some of the words, some of the verbs, for example, are, in the first text are less complex, I would say, or less to understand than the second one, like with is, for example, right? But in the second one, you have the verbs reproduce, and you also have to include many more participants that, in the first one, you don't have to include. Like in the first one, we don't see the children, right? But in the second one, you have to include that because you are adding information with the verb reproduce. So.
There, if organisms did not produce, so you have a dependent clause versus without reproduction. So then if and did not becomes without reproduction, life would quickly come to an end.
Yeah, a lot more dependent clauses also. Yeah, in the second one, the if clause and the when clause at the end, right? There's also another one in the middle. So when the genetic material duplicates, so same thing that you were talking about for the if clause, Ru. So.
Usually, this is an example of what I was talking about earlier. Then the entire clause becomes nominalized. So when,
when this process is combined, becomes the combination of.
And so nominalization on a practical level is a very powerful strategy for teaching academic writing, since most of you here are teaching English at the higher institutions. Nominalization becomes a good strategy for repackaging clauses and teaching how to translate spoken language into written like academic language. back
Mhm.
to that chart with a spoken language, written language table. It's an eye-opening exercise for that function of teaching academic writing.
Yeah, great. I think we can go to the next slide and then finalize the presentation. I think we can go to the next slide. Yeah. So what Ru was just alluding to is actually this, that we have normalizations of actions allows us to organize our texts in terms of their ideas, reasons, causes. You're not going to be referring to yourself. You can be kind of referring to these ideas and concepts. And changing from spoken to written language includes the process of normalization. So the nouns are, the verbs are typically turned into nouns, but you also have adjectives that can be turned into nouns and adverbs that can be turned into nouns. It's typically from verbs to nouns, but we also have other parts of speech that can be turned into nouns.
Mm-hmm.
And normalization has two main advantages in terms of rhetorical organization and increased lexical density, especially for academic writing, as we were talking about. So normalization can help with the flow of information, and that's why we're talking about normalization in the context of textual meaning, right? In the context of constructing a cohesive message, because it has a role in that. And of course, with increased lexical density, you can express a lot more in fewer words. So that's really an important piece. I think we can move to the next slide, and those are our references. And I think that's it. That's what we have for today. We can stop sharing. Yep. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to the presenters. Please take time for questions if you have a few questions. I know we're running late, but maybe we'll take a question or two. Of what there was, how can this work be useful to, how can this information be useful to your work?
Actually, it can be useful more for the work of our students. We are just to conduct their work in their writing.
Yeah.
And giving them some points of view how we can, with the help of this nominalization and lexical density. Luciana, I have this example of the spider. Why spider, for example? Just wonder. But it will help, really. And thank you very much for your presentation.
Mm-hmm. You're welcome.
Thank you, Ruslana, for organizing this webinar in the series of webinars for teachers from TESOL Ukraine. Now we have really special guests and special speakers, and I believe all really enjoyed this wonderful evening. You've converted our evening into a real creative workshop, virtual creative workshop. Thank you for all your support, for sharing your knowledge, your thoughts, your ideas, and we'll be waiting for the next webinar and looking forward for this webinar. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity, everyone, to present, and thanks to my research team for actually working on the slides and getting all of that done. and I really appreciate your time to joining our collaboration with TESOL Ukraine, which hopefully will just grow in the future. So, and thanks, Ru, for the invitation.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you guys presenting today and sharing with TESOL Ukraine community. Thanks to all the students as well. It was wonderful.
Great.
Thank you.
Have a good rest of your day. I will